Welcome back to a deep dive. We're looking into a really complex case today, built on, well, intense public pressure, forensic science, and some pretty serious legal battles. The murder of Karina Vetrano. This story, it involves not just a horrific crime, but also these critical questions about constitutional rights, racial profiling, and really the absolute limits of forensic evidence.
Yeah, this investigation went high profile, like immediately. And it wasn't just the brutality, which was shocking, but it was this massive 6-month struggle, right? Trying to link the DNA they found to anyone, the pressure on the NYPD, and, the whole community. It was just immense. So we're looking at sources detailing Karina's life, the specific forensic evidence, which is key here, and that really contentious path through 2 separate trials, and a conviction that's still being legally disputed even now.
So our mission today is to unpack the story. Karina Vetrano, 30 years old, a New York speech pathologist. Her evening run in August 2016, it turned fatal. We need to examine the specific details that really define this whole investigation. Things like, the public funding this huge reward, kind of bypassing traditional channels, and then these explosive claims later on about a quote-unquote DNA dragnet. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, and I think to really understand the impact, you have to start with Karina herself. The victim and the immediate context of what happened, it's hard to reconcile the vibrant life she seemed to have with the absolute brutality of her death in a park she knew so well.
Okay, so Karina Ann Vetrano, born July 12, 1986. She was 30 when she died. And from everything we see, she was actively building her life, her career path. She had a master's degree in speech pathology from St. John's University, and she was actually using it, working with children with autism right there in Manhattan.
Yeah, and beyond just the career, the sources really paint this picture of someone who is deeply engaged with life, an aspiring writer, a passionate world traveler. Apparently, she'd even appear in a short film back in 2013, one inspired by her own writing. So she wasn't just dreaming about these things, she was actually doing them. But she still had these deep community roots. Lived with her parents, Philip and Kathy Vetrano, in Howard Beach, that Queens neighborhood.
Right, and her father's background, Philip's background, it added this layer of just profound public sympathy, didn't it? He was a retired NYC fire department worker, and crucially, he'd served at Ground Zero after 9/11. The absolute terrible irony, a man who dedicated his life to the city, survived that horror only to have his daughter murdered, practically steps from home. That really resonated.
It really did. Which brings us to that day, Tuesday, August 2nd, 2016. It was late afternoon, just a routine run for her.
Yeah.
She heads into Spring Creek Park. It's this marshy area, literally less than a block from her house. Familiar place, maybe a bit overgrown.
And the critical detail, the one that just hangs over everything, is that she ran alone that day. Her dad, Philip, he was her usual running partner, but he couldn't go. He had this painful back injury grounding him. And apparently he expressed real concern, strong concerns about her going into that park by herself, but she went anyway. Last seen heading in just after 5 p.m.
And when she didn't come back, when the calls, the texts just went unanswered, Philip Vetrano, he got, well, obviously desperately worried. He contacted a neighbor who, as it turns out, was an NYPD police chief. So that mobilized things really quickly. An intense, very localized search started right away.
And the search ended, well, in the worst possible way. Around 11 p.m. that night, it was her father, Philip, who found her body, face down about 15 feet off the path in this really thick, overgrown area of weeds. The scene immediately told them this wasn't any kind of accident.
No. The autopsy later confirmed it was death by manual strangulation, a homicide. But the forensic evidence right there at the scene, it just established the sheer violence involved and the level of resistance. The sources keep coming back to this phrase, a ferocious fight for her life.
And that fight, it left its mark, physically. She'd been hit hard in the back of the head with a rock. Her teeth were cracked, indicating she'd bitten her attacker with incredible force. She'd clearly been dragged off the path. Her hands were clutching grass, and there was a specific handprint found on her neck from the strangulation itself.
The state of her clothing, too, confirmed the assault was sexual. Her sports bra was pulled down. Her shorts, underwear, they were rolled around one thigh, pulled off the other leg entirely. And her legs, her body, just covered in scratches and bruises.
And this terrible, ferocious struggle, this defensive fight, that became the absolute linchpin for the whole investigation that followed, because it meant the attacker almost certainly left his own physical evidence behind.
Exactly. DNA was recovered from multiple critical spots, under Karina's fingernails, on her back, and crucially on her cell phone, which they found lying nearby in the weeds. So, okay, you have immediate, seemingly overwhelming DNA evidence, They label it male donor A. Usually that's, the investigator's dream scenario. But despite having this critical clue right from the start, the initial 6 months, the investigation just hit a complete dead end.
Which is fascinating, right? They run the DNA through CODIS, the national database, and all the local ones. Nothing. No hits. So the investigation just balloons. The NYPD, they end up examining over 600 DNA samples voluntarily given. They checked like 1,700 reports, follow up on more than 250 different leads. It's a massive effort.
But here's where we see that first really big pivot, the one that later becomes central to the legal controversy. Initially, the police were apparently looking for suspects described as 2 white men. However, the forensic analysis of the DNA profile itself, this male donor A, it identified the profile as belonging to a black man, and that just completely changed the direction they were heading.
Right. And that pivot, moving from one description to focusing based purely on that genetic profile over 6 months, that created this intense pressure cooker situation. The sources describe how, after that identification, the NYPD then focused heavily on black men in that local area. They eventually interviewed and collected saliva samples, DNA samples, from 384 black men for their local index system.
And that approach, focusing on a specific racial group based only on a DNA profile without another link, that's precisely what fueled those later claims of a racial dragnet.
Yeah, absolutely. Meanwhile, the public was just desperate for answers. And this was amplified by the family's extreme activism. The Vetrano family, they became these really strong, very vocal proponents for a controversial technique, familial DNA testing.
Right. For anyone listening who isn't familiar, standard DNA testing needs an exact match in the database. Familial DNA, though, lets investigators search for partial matches. The idea is it might flag a close relative, a father, a brother, maybe a son who is in the system, even if the perpetrator isn't. And that could lead them indirectly to the killer.
But it's legally tricky, isn't it? Because you're essentially using the DNA of people who aren't suspects to potentially implicate a relative. Huge privacy concerns, constitutional questions for those non-suspect family members. And the NYPD, at the time, they actually had policies against using it. The Vetrano family, they kind of found ways to push around those roadblocks.
They did. They set up this massive private reward fund through GoFundMe. It raised over $290,000, way more than they initially aimed for. This huge reward, plus a $10,000 police reward, was meant to incentivize tips, maybe encourage someone close to the killer to come forward, maybe even offer their own DNA for comparison. It showed just how intensely the community was invested in getting justice for Karina.
And here's where things get really interesting, where this very local tragedy suddenly connects to this much broader national conversation. Less than a week after Karina's murder, on August 7th, another young woman, 27-year-old Vanessa Marcotte, was found killed while out jogging in Massachusetts. The circumstances were strikingly similar.
Yeah, the media immediately jumped on the parallels. 2 young, professional women killed while jogging in familiar public spaces after a brutal assault. Now, eventually, DNA proved they were killed by different people, but the fact that these happened so close together, it just rocketed both the Vetrano case and the Marcotte case into the center of this really heated national debate about the safety of women, particularly when exercising alone.
The impact was huge. So while this massive DNA search was ongoing and hitting walls, police released other things. There was a composite sketch of a person of interest, some guy a utility worker saw near the park. They also released home surveillance video, showing Karina running just minutes before the attack.
Yeah.
But for 6 long months, none of it led to a name. It was just cold.
Yeah, completely cold. The DNA was too unique, no database match. The sketches, the leads, they all went nowhere. But the breakthrough, when it finally came, it wasn't from familial DNA or some cutting-edge tech. It was classic police work, just memory.
That's the real pivot point in actually solving it, isn't it? Not the familial DNA the family pushed for, but good old-fashioned police recall. 6 months later. And it came from an NYPD Lieutenant John Russo, who actually lived in Howard Beach himself.
Exactly. Russo remembered seeing a guy acting suspiciously in the neighborhood, looking into cars, way back in May 2016, so just a few months before the murder. He managed to trace that memory back through an old stop-and-frisk report. And then separately, Russo also recalled a 911 call around that time about a suspicious guy with a crowbar lurking in people's backyards nearby. Notes from the officers who responded to that initial 911 call, they had a name, Chanel Lewis.
Lewis, well, he immediately became a compelling person to look at. He's identified as 20 years old, unemployed, living in a low-income housing project in East New York. And the key thing, that location is less than 3 miles from Spring Creek Park where Karina was killed.
Yeah.
So you've got proximity, plus this prior record of suspicious activity right there in the area. He jumps to the top of the list.
Right. So once they identify him, police approach Lewis. And according to them, he voluntarily gives a cheek swab for DNA. The lab results come back fast, and they're overwhelming. Lewis's DNA is a match. It matches the samples from Karina's body under her nails, on her back, and on her cell phone. So he's arrested February 4th, 2017, charged with second-degree murder.
Now, Lewis didn't have a prior adult criminal record, but the sources do point to some, let's say, worrying patterns in his past interactions with police. He had several prior run-ins, 3 summons back in 2013, and 2 of those summons were specifically for violating rules in Spring Creek Park, the exact location of the murder. The other was for public urination, so it confirmed he had a history of being in that specific environment.
Yeah, and beyond just the summonses, reports started surfacing, characterizing Lewis as maybe mentally unstable, a bit of a loner. Investigators highlighted these claims that Lewis harbored a kind of hatred for women. This apparently stemmed from an incident years earlier where he supposedly told a teacher's aide he wanted to, quote, stab all the girls at his school. Now, this context was definitely used by the prosecution later to suggest a possible motive or psychological background.
So investigators start piecing together a theory based on all this. They believe Lewis left his home on August 2nd after arguing with his family. He walked to the park nearby. And the attack on Karina, they theorize it was completely random, a chance encounter, premeditation, like, did he go there planning to attack someone? That was never definitively proven. But the encounter itself was clearly opportunistic and incredibly brutal.
The narrative around what Lewis was like that specific night, August 2nd, it gets really contradictory, and a lot of that comes from his own family. His mother claimed Lewis came home that night looking disheveled, said his clothes were torn. Lewis apparently told her he'd been mugged by a group of men. But critically, he never filed a police report about this supposed mugging, and investigators found zero evidence to back up that claim.
But the physical evidence from Lewis himself is pretty hard to dismiss. The very next day, August 3rd, his father took him to the emergency room. Hospital records confirmed it. Lewis was treated for scratches and cuts on his upper body. And he had a significant hand injury. The doctor who treated him reportedly noted that the hand injury looked highly consistent with injuries you'd get from punching someone.
Yeah. That's significant. And interestingly, his father, who was a former school principal, he claimed he hadn't even heard about Karina Vetrano's death until his son was arrested months later. Despite, the immediate and absolutely massive local media coverage, that detail, it just adds another layer of complexity regarding the family's awareness or maybe denial of what happened and Lewis's injuries.
The investigators, though, they had one extremely specific, peculiar detail that really solidified their certainty before they even went to trial. Lewis, in his statements to police, he described something very specific. A peculiar puddle of muddy water that detectives knew they had seen right near Karina's body at the crime scene.
Right, that puddle detail, that was absolutely devastating for the defense later on, because it's really hard to explain how Lewis could possibly know about such a unique temporary detail of the crime scene unless he was actually there. It strongly suggested uncoerced, direct knowledge, and that specific point, combined with that incredibly strong DNA match, that formed the absolute bedrock of the prosecution's case heading into the trials.
Okay, so the prosecution feels pretty confident, right? They've got the DNA, they've got this recorded confession with the puddle detail. It's like an open and shut case. But the defense team, they immediately go on the attack. Their argument. The confession was forced, coerced, and the DNA evidence, possibly contaminated. And this tension, it leads to not one, but 2 incredibly contentious trials.
Yeah, the first trial kicks off in November 2018. The testimony, as you'd expect, was highly emotional. Philip Vetrano talking about finding his daughter's body, just gut-wrenching. But the core of the state's case, it really rested on the science, the probability.
Right. A forensic biologist testified. The chance of the DNA found on Karina belonging to anyone other than Chanel Lewis. 1 in 6 trillion.
Yeah.
Trillion with a T. I mean, just to put that in perspective for you listening, that's like hundreds of times the population of the entire planet. That's the level of certainty the prosecution laid out for the jury.
Exactly. And on top of that, the jurors watched the videotape of Lewis's confession. They heard him admit to police, he hit her and stuff like that, saying one thing led to another. The prosecution painted this picture of a simple, random encounter that just tragically spiraled into violence.
So the defense strategy, it had to focus entirely on undermining the human elements. The confession, the police work. Lewis maintained his not guilty plea throughout, and his lawyers argued really vehemently that the confession was coerced. They also tried to preemptively cast doubt on the DNA, suggesting contamination could have happened given the high-pressure, high-profile nature of the investigation.
And they were skilled at it, at sowing that seed of doubt. By really hammering on the possibility of police missteps, potential contamination, they managed to convince at least one juror, maybe more, because the first trial ended in a hung jury, a mistrial, November 21st, 2018. That was a huge blow for the prosecution and obviously for the Vetrano family. It proved that even those astronomical DNA statistics weren't necessarily enough to overcome deep-seated skepticism about police procedures, especially regarding confessions.
Right, so the mistrial forces the prosecution to regroup, rethink their strategy for the retrial, which started in March 2019. They basically decided to double down on both the emotional impact and the scientific clarity. Crucially, they called Karina's mother, Kathy Vetrano, to testify this time. She talked about her last conversation with her daughter. That was a really powerful emotional element they hadn't used in the first trial.
And they sharpened the focus on the DNA statistics again. The lead prosecutor, he really hammered home that probability. He stated it was 376 billion times more probable that the DNA under Karina's fingernails belonged to Lewis than to anyone else on Earth. They were trying to make the DNA evidence so absolutely bulletproof that the jury would just have to dismiss the defense's theories about contamination or a false confession.
But the defense, they wouldn't budge on the coercion argument. They kept pointing to the circumstances of the interrogation. Lewis questioned for 11 hours straight, including 4 hours alone in a windowless room. They argued that Lewis, who they characterized as having, low mental capacity, was just incredibly susceptible to that kind of pressure.
And they highlighted what they saw as glaring inconsistencies in his taped statement. And Lewis claimed Karina drowned in that puddle, but the autopsy was crystal clear. Strangulation, injury to her carotid artery, not drowning. The defense argued these errors showed Lewis was either genuinely confused, mentally incapable of giving a true account, or worse, maybe he was just repeating details the police had somehow inadvertently fed him during that long interrogation.
Yeah, and they also pointed to those moments during the taped interview where Lewis seemed, detached or confused, asking if he could talk to his mother. And that notorious moment, asking if he could watch cartoons. Those moments were clearly designed to portray him as vulnerable, childlike almost, and to seriously undermine the idea that his confession was truly voluntary.
The jury deliberation for that second trial, the retrial, apparently had this really significant moment of internal conflict. Sources reported afterwards that one juror initially hesitated. This juror admitted having real fears about a wrongful conviction and specifically mentioned the Central Park 5 case, which, underscores the huge psychological hurdle jurors faced trying to balance overwhelming scientific data against this documented history, especially in New York City, of coerced confessions involving minority suspects.
But ultimately, it seems the sheer strength of that scientific evidence, the DNA statistics, combined with those specific unique details Lewis knew, like the puddle, and that's what convinced that hesitant juror, and the rest of the panel. After only about 5 hours of deliberation, they came back. Guilty on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of sexual abuse, April 1st, 2019.
So, okay, guilty verdict. But what does it all mean? Well, the legal controversies, they were far from over. They actually intensified right as the appeal process was getting started.
Exactly. Just before Lewis was scheduled to be sentenced, his lawyers received this mysterious anonymous letter. Allegedly, it was from a police officer. And this letter contained just explosive allegations that immediately became the absolute core of their appeal strategy.
Right. This anonymous letter claimed that authorities had collected DNA, basically swept up DNA, from at least 360 black men in this targeted race-biased dragnet before they ever focused on Lewis. And maybe even more controversially, it alleged that the police had initially zeroed in on 2 white men who lived near the park, but then just dropped that lead entirely once the DNA profile came back pointing towards a black man.
Lewis's lawyers, naturally, seized on this immediately. They filed motions arguing the entire investigation was flawed from the start, suffering from tunnel vision, they called it, driven by racial profiling. And they claimed prosecutors had improperly withheld what's called exculpatory evidence, basically. Evidence that might suggest Lewis was innocent or maybe point towards someone else entirely, which, if true, would be a massive violation of his rights.
Of course, the NYPD and the Queens District Attorney's Office, they categorically rejected all of it. They put out a statement saying the anonymous letter was just riddled with falsehoods and inaccuracies. They insisted the evidence, the DNA, the recorded confession overwhelmingly proved Lewis was guilty and argued that the trial itself had already thoroughly examined and dismissed these procedural concerns.
So despite the defense pushing hard for a hearing based on these misconduct allegations, which did delay the sentencing a bit, the judge ultimately upheld the guilty verdict. Chanel Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. on April 23, 2019.
So the conviction stood, legally. But that shadow cast by the investigation tactics, it definitely lingered. Post-conviction activism picked up, reflecting this really deep community distrust, particularly around those claims of racial profiling and the potentially coercive nature of that long interrogation.
Yeah, the sources talk about a major effort back in 2021. Nearly 40,000 people actually signed a petition asking prosecutors to re-examine the whole case through their Conviction Integrity Unit, the CIU. And for you listening, the CIU, that's a special unit inside a prosecutor's office. Their job is specifically to review past convictions, usually looking for potential wrongful ones that need correcting.
And the advocates behind this petition, they were really explicit about their concerns. They drew that direct, very sensitive parallel again. Community advocates actually said publicly, quote, "We had a Central Park 5, we will not have a Howard Beach one with Chanel Lewis entered." They were basically voicing this fear that the intense public pressure might have led to a compromised investigation and potentially the conviction of an innocent minority man, echoing that painful history.
It's such a powerful and really heavy legacy, isn't it? The tragedy of Karina Vetrano, it seems to have left these two really distinct, almost conflicting impacts on society and the legal system. It kind of reflects both the best and maybe the worst aspects of modern criminal investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. On one hand, the case just indelibly highlighted the vulnerability felt by runners, especially women running alone. It definitely inspired foundations, conversations, all dedicated to women's safety and protection. And the image of Karina fighting back so fiercely, it became the symbol of resilience. Plus, the family's activism really set a new benchmark for how victims' families could engage publicly in these high-profile cases.
But then, on the other hand, the investigation itself became this pivotal example of the raw power of forensic evidence. I mean, that 1 in 376 billion DNA match, it's almost impossible to argue with in court. And the case certainly galvanized the push for more advanced DNA search techniques like familial searching. Yet at the exact same time, it raised these profound, uncomfortable questions about police procedure, about the ethical lines in targeted DNA collection, and about protecting the constitutional rights of an accused person, especially when there's such intense public pressure demanding justice now.
And that tension right there between using incredibly powerful science to get a conviction and making absolutely sure that constitutional protections aren't getting trampled in the rush for closure, that's the real lasting dilemma of the Vetrano case, I think. It forces you listening to ask, how much procedural compromise are we as a society willing to accept, even when the scientific evidence looks completely undeniable?
So we've traced the path of this incredibly charged case, from the horrific details of Karina Vetrano's last moments, through the complex legal twists surrounding the DNA, the confession, those defense allegations of racial bias. It really is a powerful reminder, isn't it, of how technology, legal scrutiny, and intense public emotion all collide when we're trying to find justice under that white-hot spotlight of media attention.
And if you connect it to the bigger picture, it raises that fundamental question. When does the public's hunger for swift justice, fueled by media, fueled by the sheer brutality of the crime, when does that get outweighed by the constitutional protections that every accused person is supposed to have? Especially when you bring in controversial methods like targeted DNA swabbing based on a profile. Where does that public interest end, and where do individual rights absolutely have to begin?
And just consider, finally, the role of Lewis's history. Those prior summonses in that specific park, not for anything violent, just minor stuff like violating park rules. How often does something like that, simple proximity, a minor history in a location, how often does that play the pivotal role? Turning a small, maybe previously ignored detail into the key piece that breaks a huge, high-stakes, cold case. Definitely something for you to mull over.
Grazie.